For more than 80 years, your Colorado River District has been working to safeguard West Slope water and keep our water on the western slope. We're protecting water supplies for the farmers and ranchers that put food on our tables. Because when farmers and ranchers thrive, the whole community thrives.
My great-grandfather came from eastern Colorado and continued farming here with my grandpa, and then my dad, now myself and my son. Water is absolutely vital to this area. Without the water, the land has very little value. The large municipalities want more and more water. The River District, it brings together the communities, the different values, and helps us to find one voice. A flowing river is important to all of us in this community.
This is your water. These are your rivers. And this is your Colorado River District. Learn more at coloradoriverdistrict.org.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth day of the River District's annual seminar, Zooming In on West Slope Water. My name is Alicia Frederick, and I'm the Director of Information and Outreach for the Colorado River District. Before we get started with today's program, I just really have to tell you guys how rewarding it's been for the River District team to see how many of our community members, partners, supporters, and newfound West Slope water warriors participating in this year's seminar. The number of registrants has been outstanding. The engagement we're getting through our Q&A has just been incredible. So please continue today to use that Q&A down in the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you may have. If we're unable to get to any of your questions, we will provide contact information for presenters so that you can follow up with any questions that you may have. For those of you who may have missed out on our previous presentations this week, we'll provide a link to those through the chat down at the bottom. But I want to give you a quick recap of what we've discussed. Monday, we took a quick back to school trip and learned about West Slope Water 101. Tuesday, we demonstrated the River District in action, highlighting projects like Elkhead Reservoir, the Lower Gunnison Project, and Windy Gap Forebay, which all benefit West Slope water users, and really reminds us what amazing projects can happen when you've got funding, collaboration, and cooperation all working together. And then there was yesterday. Yesterdays were a part of a conversation. We were allowed to be part of a conversation about the hotspot that's right here in our district and how warming temperatures and continued drought are affecting our water supply, agricultural community, and water managers throughout the basin. It wasn't all doom and gloom, but as Andy reminded us, the River District produces about 65% of the annual average flows in the entire Colorado River. So what happens here affects all of us. So it's important to stay informed about the challenges of West Slope water, especially when it comes to drought. Today is another important topic. Excuse me, it's actually of primary importance. For those who might not know, agriculture is an important economic, cultural, and aesthetic component of Western Colorado. I didn't know this, but there's nearly 12,000 farms in Western Colorado, covering a total of more than 5.7 million acres of land. The Water Bank Group released the Upper Basin Demand Management Economic Study in Western Colorado to explore how this large piece of our economy would be affected under a possible demand management program. And we have three folks here to explain the ins and outs of this study to us and to answer our questions. So again, please don't forget to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. The first speaker that we have today that I'd like to introduce to you is Mr. Aaron Derlingsen. Aaron is the Water Projects Director for the Nature Conservancy's Colorado River Program, where he works in partnership with water users on pragmatic, solution-oriented approaches to meeting water needs for people and nature. Aaron works with agricultural water users, municipalities, and industry throughout the Colorado River Basin to develop and implement innovative approaches to water management to improve the health of rivers and streams we all rely on. Aaron holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Colorado and a master's in community and regional planning from the University of Oregon. Before joining the Nature Conservancy, Aaron worked at the Rio Grande Headwaters Land Trust, helping protect important working lands, wildlife habitat, and water resources in Colorado's San Luis Valley. Thanks for being with us, Aaron. It's really nice to see you, even if it is just zooming in here today. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I'm happy to be here and appreciate the opportunity to chat with y'all. Wish we could be in person, but we'll make do.
You know, before we get started on this study, I think it's really important to provide just a little background for folks that may not be familiar with the Water Bank Group or the idea of demand management for that matter. So can we start there and you kind of give us a breakdown of who the Water Bank Work Group is?
Yeah, absolutely. The Water Bank Work Group is a collaborative effort that really started, I think, in about 2008 as a conversation between the River District and the Southwest District discussing what might happen in the event that Colorado couldn't meet its obligations under the Colorado River Compact, right? So the Colorado River Compact divides the waters of the Colorado River Basin between the lower basin and the upper basin, which includes Colorado. And these two boards were discussing, you know, hey, what might happen if there were issues under the compact where the upper basin couldn't deliver enough water downstream to meet its obligations. And they thought, you know, this isn't something that's imminent. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it is a concern. And given where the hydrology is in the basin, it's something we should plan on addressing, because if we don't have a plan to address that, it could be bad for the west slope. It sort of played out what might happen if Colorado couldn't meet that obligation. It might put junior users at risk. When you look at who those junior users are in Colorado, it's a lot of municipalities on the Front Range, it's certain industries, it's uses that would be very hard to disrupt. And they thought, well, what might those users do? They might come to the west slope, purchase agricultural water rights, dry those up and send them downstream in order to continue their own uses. And again, without a process in place to either avoid that or help mitigate it, they were concerned about what it could mean for west slope, the west slope and west slope water. And then from that initial conversation, it grew into the collaborative effort that it is today. And those two entities reached out, and the group now includes the Nature Conservancy, Tri-State Generation and Transmission, and then three irrigation entities or sort of water conservancy districts, including the Uncompahgre Valley Water Users Association, the Grand Valley Water Users Association, and the Upper Gunnison Water Conservancy District. And the group has changed a little bit over time, as has the concept we've been exploring, but at the core of that partnership has really been a focus on what can we do to address potential risks posed by the compact, and how can we do that in a way that makes sure we're meeting the needs of our municipalities and our industry, but also agriculture and the environment, you know, recognizing that we don't want to have any solution that really rolls out on the back of any one industry, any one geography, any one water use sector. And so that's why that group is collaborative in nature and has those different interests, so we can try and figure out solutions that would work for us all and protect, you know, everything that we love about this great state.
Yeah, that's a really diverse group of partners to engage in this study. For people who may not understand exactly what demand management is, can you get into a little bit about what that is and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Water Bank Work Group started on an initial concept of, you know, again, you have this issue where you might not be able to deliver enough water downstream. So therefore, you might have a process that would compensate willing water users to temporarily reduce their use. And that water can either go downstream or it can help, you know, offset some of those critical junior uses for health and safety, for example. That's evolved to the concept of demand management we have today, which really comes out of the drought contingency plan that was signed last year by the 7 Colorado River Basin states and the Bureau of Reclamation. That has planned components for the lower basin and planned components for the upper basin. The upper basin's drought contingency plan includes really 3 main things. It includes water supply augmentation, so ways that we might be able to bring water into the basin or create more water in order to really ensure continued compliance with the Colorado River Compact and protect these critical reservoir levels in Lake Powell, which are sort of our health indicator for the basin. So it looked at water supply augmentation. I looked at reservoir operations, so we can move the water that we have around in different ways in order to make sure we can keep those critical reservoir levels up and meet those obligations. And then the third thing that drought contingency plan defined was demand management and a demand management storage account. And the idea is that you could have sort of a rainy day, or I guess a drought day account in Lake Powell that would be available for the upper basin to use if and when needed to help ensure that it can keep delivering enough water under the compact. And you would fill that water up with water savings generated with demand management, which it defines as temporary, voluntary, and compensated reductions in existing water use. And so, for example, you might have a farmer or a rancher who could enroll in this kind of demand management program. They would be compensated, not to irrigate for a year or 2 years, and those water savings could be delivered downstream and kept in this account. And then after that 2 years, they would go back to normal production, and you could rotate that around. And by rotating it around, you can reduce the impact while you fill up that account that could help protect the upper basin. And then I think as anybody who starts to think about that concept and explore what it might mean, it raises a host of questions, right? How is that going to work for the individual where they're reducing water use on their farm or ranch, right? That's a critical input to their operation. You can't just pull it out and still have business as usual. So what does it mean for those individuals? How do they manage that on their property? How are they compensated? What about their neighbors? Start to drill into those issues. And then it raises other questions about, well, what does this mean for other people on their ditch or within their irrigation district? What does it mean for their community that might be very tied to the agricultural economics, right? What does it mean for the tractor dealer or the seed supplier? Or what does it mean for the rest of us that enjoy the green open space that agriculture provides, or some of the wildlife habitat that it provides? And what does it mean sort of for the broader context of the West Slope, where ag is, not just a kind of key part of the economy, but a key part of the social fabric that you mentioned. And the Water Bank Work Group has really been drilling into those questions over the years, right? We looked at, well, how much water might be needed for something like demand management? What are those critical junior uses? How much water might be available to supply those, right? What is our existing water use on the West Slope that's pre-compact or post-compact? And then how might this work for all the different irrigation districts and water users on the West Slope? I think we recognize they're far from uniform. You have small operations, large operations, federal projects, private projects, tribal projects, and the Water Bank Work Group really wanted to understand what the issues and opportunities were with those different water users to implement something like demand management. And then out of all that and where we're heading out today is, even if it made sense for an individual or a certain irrigation district, what might we want to know about the broader economic impacts in order to understand, how such a program might be able to work, or what sideboards or parameters we would want to put on a program to make sure that it's, not only serving a primary purpose of providing water security, but not doing it in a way that's going to irreversibly harm our economies or create unintended consequences.
Thank you so much for that. I'm more than excited to hear what Doug Jevons has to tell us about this study. So I'll take this time now to go ahead and introduce Doug. Doug leads the Water and Natural Resources Economics practice at BBC Research and Consulting, and has worked at BBC for nearly 3 decades. He recently directed the study of potential economic impacts for demand management in Western Colorado, and also worked as the lead economist for the 2019 technical update to the Colorado Water Plan. He used to split his time between Denver and Buena Vista, Colorado, and now he's splitting it between Denver, Buena Vista, and good old Zoom. So I appreciate you for being here, Doug. I'm really anxious to hear what you have to say, so I'm going to go ahead and give you the floor. Thanks.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Alicia. And I want to thank Aaron as well for his excellent introduction into demand management and the drought contingency plan and our study as well. So I think we want to get the study up on the screen here. There it is. And so a little bit of background, and also I want to thank everyone, by the way, for joining in today too. It's as Alicia and Aaron mentioned, we wish we could be doing this in person, but we really appreciate you taking the time to listen in and ask questions and all that sort of thing. So the study that we're going to be talking through today really began for us in the spring of 2019, so about 18 months ago. We just recently produced the final report, and I think it's on the River District's website, or if it isn't, it will be soon. And we're kind of in the midst right now of a bit of a virtual tour around Western Colorado, presenting the study and its results to various water boards and different organizations and so forth. I think, though, that today's group is the biggest audience we'll probably have for any of these presentations, so it's great to be here. So let's see if I can get this screen to move here. Okay. All right. One second here, we're having a little trouble advancing the screen. There we go. So in terms of what the purpose of this study was all about, so as Aaron kind of led in, we're focusing a lot on the secondary impacts from demand management. What do we mean by secondary impacts? We're really talking about the impacts beyond the participating farms and ranches. So the impacts on tractor dealers or seed suppliers, as Aaron mentioned, or even the impacts on local grocery stores that serve the community and local communities as a whole. And so that's a big part of our focus. We will talk also, though, about the direct impacts or primary impacts on the participants, participating farms and ranches in a program like this. We're also, another key goals of the study were to think about different potential impact implementation aspects and possible ways to potentially design a program or operate a program to try to maximize the potential benefits and minimize the potential adverse effects. I'm going to start out, no one wants to spend a lot of time diving deeply into methodology and data sources and modeling and all that sort of thing, but I do want to go through just a few quick slides to give you a little bit more background that I think is important to understand the study. This graphic, it just shows in a kind of a simple way the framework that we developed for analyzing the secondary impacts. So you can think about it really as two sides of the equation. On the left-hand side, we know that, as Aaron mentioned, that this would be a voluntary and compensated program, and the use of those payments for the participants, their local spending of those payments, would create some economic benefits potentially within Western Colorado and within the local regions. The other side, the right-hand side, is the potential adverse impacts, economic impacts in Western Colorado. And we know that reducing consumptive use for demand management implies reductions in production. And of course, with less production, you're going to see potentially less spending for agricultural services and inputs, and as potentially inputs on the customers who currently rely on hay production and crop production from the participating farms. The scope of the study was all of Western Colorado, and the study is really conducted at a basin level. So if you do look at the report, we won't go through all the basin detail today, but you'll see that we've analyzed the potential impacts for each of the 4 major basins across Western Colorado. I should mention too that we also, an important part of this study was that we convened stakeholder groups in each of the basins, and they were they were heavily weighted towards agricultural representatives, but also included local government representatives and representatives from other industries. And we met with the stakeholders in each basin twice, with the initial meeting focusing really on some data questions and also on the approach that we were going to take to the study. And then the second meeting to go over and discuss preliminary results and make refinements to those results. As I said, the study's conducted at a basin level. So we really work with basin-wide average data. And that's tricky because we know that, of course, every farm and ranch in Western Colorado is different. And there could be a great deal of difference even within an individual county or certainly within the basin. So, you know, if a demand management program moves towards actual implementation, there will probably need to be additional studies more focused on the specific areas and the specific characteristics of the farms and ranches that may be participating in the program. But one of the key aspects, yeah, thanks. One of the key aspects of the analysis was the development of basin average crop budgets for hay and corn and alfalfa. And those crop budgets in turn were critical in estimating things like what the participation payments might have to be and what the impacts of reduced production might be as well. Okay. And then this is the last kind of quasi-methodology slide, but I'll mention that we, in order to quantify the secondary impacts, we developed basin-specific economic models for each of the 4 basins, and we used a tool called the INPLAN model, which is a regional input-output modeling system that was originally developed by the Forest Service. It's very widely used across the country. And that enabled us to quantify secondary impacts and break those down between what are called indirect impacts, which is really the suppliers to farms and ranches, and induced impacts, which are more of those household suppliers like grocery stores and other community businesses. So in order to quantify the potential secondary impacts or even the potential direct impacts of from a demand management situation, we needed to define some scenarios. And in the study, we lay out 2 different scenarios. One is we call the moderate scenario, or scenario 1, and that's really tied to the demand storage agreement that Aaron mentioned earlier. So that agreement authorizes a 500,000 acre-foot pool, if you will, for potential use by an upper basin demand management program. Based on the relative shares of consumptive use in the system, the Western Colorado agriculture share of that 500,000 acre feet might be on the order of 125,000 in total, or about a quarter of that total number. So in scenario 1, we look at a program that would be designed to gather a 25,000 acre foot per year reduction in consumptive use from Western Colorado farms and ranches over a 5-year period. In other words, be able to provide about 125,000 acre feet of the 500,000 acre feet for that pool. On the, it's also, however, I think generally recognized that 500,000 acre feet may certainly not be enough to make a very meaningful difference in terms of the probability of a potential compact curtailment. So we also look at a larger scenario, scenario 2, or the aggressive scenario, which is basically 4 times the scale of that. And so that scenario we envision, or we hypothesize, a 25,000 acre foot per year reduction in consumptive use within each of the 4 basins. So 100,000 acre feet per year, again, over a 5-year period. This could correspond to something like a 2 million acre foot potential water bank to try to mitigate or reduce the risk of curtailment. Okay, so when we start thinking about the effects, one of the important initial questions is what types of farms and ranches might participate. And when you look at the data in terms of where the irrigated acres are in Western Colorado, what they're being used for, the large majority, about 90% or more of irrigated acreage, is in either grass hay or alfalfa or corn production. There are a lot of other crops grown in Western Colorado, of course. There's orchards, there's vineyards, other types of small grains and so forth. But the vast majority is in these forage types of crops. And also the economics of those crops are probably more favorable, as well as the likely feasibility of being able to fallow crops for a 1 or 2 year period. So one of the key assumptions in this analysis is that most of the participating acreage would probably be in grass hay and alfalfa production. So the left, again, coming back to kind of that overall framework we talked about earlier, we'll start by talking a little bit about what the benefits, economic benefits of the program might be. And that really starts with trying to assess what the level of compensation might have to be. So our study team has been involved in water leasing programs in a number of states across the West. And One of the not too surprising things that we know from that experience is that the compensation or participation payments have to be large enough for participation to make sense from a financial perspective to the farmers and ranchers that might enroll. And typically we found that that requires a premium over the reduction that they would experience in their net operating income, typically about 50% over and above that amount. And we also believe that the participation payments would have to cover any direct costs associated with fallowing to manage that acreage and so forth in the year or two when it's not being fully irrigated. Payments may also have to be made to ditch companies for administrative reasons and to compensate for lost revenues and so forth. We haven't included those ditch company payments in the analysis because they're so site specific that we really can't generalize them, but we focused just on what the payments to the participants might be. So this may be a little hard to see, but based on the basin average crop budgets that we put together that we talked about earlier, we developed an estimate of what the break-even point might be in terms of the payment for reducing consumptive use and what that payment might be, including the 50% premium I just talked about. And so if we focus on the version with the premium, which is the green component on the right-hand side of that spectrum, the regional average estimate for the payments is about $236 an acre foot. On average, water consumptive use is about 2 acre-feet per acre in Western Colorado. So that corresponds to about $470 or so per acre. That number actually turns out to be pretty close to the actual payment levels in a pilot program that was run in the last few years by the Grand Valley Water Users Association, which was, again, a pretty similar payment level. But there certainly could be a lot of variation in that depending on yields and other characteristics of the participating farms and ranches. And you can see in this graphic that even just looking at the variation across the basins and across the different crops, you get a pretty wide range of potential payments. From the standpoint of how those payments might translate into economic benefits, secondary economic benefits in Western Colorado, there's really 3 key questions. Number 1 is how the payments would be spent, what the farmers and ranchers would do with the money. Number 2 is how much of that money would be spent locally within the basin or within Western Colorado. And then third is where the money comes from. And so, you know, again, drawing from prior experience with leasing programs, we think we have a pretty good idea of the types of expenditures that participants would probably make with that money. And often one of the benefits of this kind of program is it can improve the financial resilience of the participating operations by helping them reduce their debt or increase their savings. So we think certainly a piece of it would go into that. Also, it may be a good opportunity to make farm improvements, buy new equipment, and all those kinds of things. But some of the money, of course, will also just be spent on household consumption. Prior experience with water leasing programs suggests in most places where you have a fairly large regional economy like the basins in Western Colorado, it's pretty common to see somewhere between 60 and 90% of those payments being spent locally. And we look at kind of both ends of that range in the study. But the third piece maybe isn't quite as obvious, but where the money comes from is also really important from the perspective of the Western Colorado economy. In order for the compensation payments and the spending of those payments to really be a regional benefit that can help offset the impacts of reduced production, the money really has to come from somewhere else. If all of that money, alternatively, if all of that money was raised in Western Colorado, then the payments are really just shifting money around within the region, not creating a new economic benefit to help offset the impacts. Turning to the other side of the equation, of course, maybe the primary focus of this study was to look at what the potential adverse impacts might be. And that's, of course, a challenging question, and there's a lot of uncertainty about this because it really depends on what types of operations participate and what do they do, how do they change their operations in order to adjust for having less consumptive use, growing less hay or corn, and how do they manage their operation under those circumstances? And this is just a kind of a simplified graphic of some of the many possibilities, but we can be fairly confident that a demand management program is going to translate into reduced hay production, that could lead to either less sales of hay to others, either within the basin within Western Colorado or even exports elsewhere, or it could translate into less feed for the rancher's own herd. If it's the latter, then the question becomes, how do they adjust for that? Do they buy and haul replacement hay from somewhere else? Do they reduce their herd size, or do they do something else? So again, depending on what the response strategies are, the impacts could be somewhat different. Focusing for the moment on the probably simplest one to quantify, which is a reduction in mechanically harvested acres as opposed to grazing acres, we developed estimates of what the reduction in production, annual production, might be across the basins under each of the two scenarios. And so you look just kind of at the bottom line in this table, on average, we estimated that that the program could result in about a $400 reduction per participating acre in terms of the value of output or value of production. That's about $200 an acre foot. And when we scale that up to the size of the scenarios, that's under scenario one, that's a little less than a $6 million annual reduction in production. Under scenario two, about a $23 million reduction in annual output or production from the participating farms and ranches. Skipping ahead a little bit and kind of summarizing some of this, when we run that through the economic models along with the potential participation payments and their local spending of those payments, what we find is that the secondary impacts from the reduction in production are pretty similar in size or scale to the potential benefits from secondary benefits from spending those payments. But that similarity masks some important distributional questions. Basically, we believe that those participation payments would be spent differently than normal operational spending by farms and ranches. So the dollars would flow to different businesses, in some cases to different industries. We think the program could also result in a shift in spending from some of the more agriculturally focused small communities located, proximate to large irrigated areas, towards communities with larger towns, or towards larger towns and cities in the region, where you're more likely to find large-scale implement dealers and some of the other things that folks would spend their participation payments on. As I mentioned, we also did quantify the direct effects or the primary effects, the on-farm and ranch effects. Most of those effects would be compensated because the participating producers would be the ones experiencing those effects. But we do believe that some hired labor positions could be at risk. About 1/3 or so of the labor on Western Colorado farms and ranches is hired labor rather than the families that own the farms and ranches and their extended families. And we also believe that there's a potential for impacting some tenant operators, but there's not a lot of tenant farms and ranches in the region. The other really critical question in terms of secondary impacts is how much a reduction in forage production, think of it as hay production primarily, might affect the livestock industry. And the Water Bank work group had previously done a study which looked at a number of ways that a demand management program might operate and the types of operations that might participate, types of farms and ranches that might participate. In that study, they found that reductions in irrigated acreage and high altitude cow-calf operations would probably have a direct proportionate impact on the size of the cattle herds. On the other hand, or other side of the equation, if you will, some of the basins, particularly the Southwest Basin and the Yampa White Basin, export a large part of their hay to other places, other states, and even other countries. So if the primary effect of if the main effect of a demand management program was to reduce exports of hay to other places, then that secondary forward linkage on the livestock industry might be occurring somewhere else. There might not be that much impact within Western Colorado. Now that gives us a really broad range of possibilities here. And so in order to try to narrow that down to something that we think is a better indicator of the sort of more likely effect, we went back and looked at historical data and looked at the relationships between hay production, which has varied a lot over the last 20 years, and hay prices and cattle inventories. And overall, over the past couple decades, the 10% reduction in hay production has correlated with about an 8% increase in the price of hay and about a 3% reduction in cattle inventories. So we quantified what the economic effects of that correlation might be based on the scale of these scenarios. A couple other considerations in terms of livestock and hay. The numbers that we're going to show you in just a minute are really based on sort of average year conditions, but we do think that the effects on prices and livestock production would vary a lot depending on whether it's a wet year, a dry year, or an average year. And at first, when we're first wading into this study, we thought that there was a real potential for that some of this reduction in hay production might primarily result in reductions in exports from these basins. But from our stakeholders in these meetings, we consistently heard that folks who are exporting hay have built those customer relationships over many years, and they're probably going to be reluctant to put those at risk to participate in a demand management program. So the potential for demand management to primarily reduce hay exports may not be as great as we might think. So, at the end of the day, what we want to do in part is to compare these potential benefits and costs. We also want to look at, are there ways that the program could try to maximize benefits, minimize adverse impacts? So this is a summary table from the report, and there's a lot of metrics within the report, but this kind of brings some of the important ones and puts them all together in a single table. So under scenario 1, which again was the 25,000 acre-feet per year reduction in consumptive use across all of western Colorado, that would correspond to fallowing about 12,700 acres of hay, alfalfa, and corn. That's about 1 in every 60 acres that's currently irrigated across the region. From an annual production standpoint, that would reduce output by between about $6 million and $9 million a year. And it would reduce on-farm and ranch jobs by somewhere between 64 and 80 jobs. And those are full-time equivalent positions. But again, it's important to note that those on-farm ranch jobs are mostly the compensated producers themselves. Some of them may be higher labor positions. We estimated the annual payment for that for the moderate program would be a little less than $6 million a year. Those are direct payments to the participants. And when we look at the payments to the participants relative to the reduction in on-farm value added, which is really a measure of farm income, combining both the income of the farm and any wages paid to the employees of the farm, the payments turn out to be somewhere between $2 and $3 million per year more than the reduction in on-farm income. And that only makes sense because if that number isn't positive and substantial, it would be very difficult to get participation in the program. We look at the secondary effects. So now we're looking at those indirect and induced effects throughout the broader economy. The jobs from the payment spending could vary. We estimated between 27 and 40 jobs could be supported by that component under the moderate scenario. That range comes about depending on how much of the money we believe is going to be spent locally. So the 27 jobs corresponds to 60% being spent locally, the 40 jobs to 90% being spent locally. Those numbers are a little smaller than the number of jobs tied to production. So we think that the secondary impacts from reducing production would be a loss of between 55 and 76 jobs under that moderate scenario. So the net change would, in terms of the number of jobs, would probably be negative. The net change in terms of income, again, including both wage and salary income and business profits, that's a little more uncertain. It could be positive or it could be negative, depending on assumptions about, again, how much the money gets spent locally, as well as assumptions about how much of an impact there is on the livestock industry. And then scenario 2 is essentially about 4 times the scale of the moderate scenario. So instead of 12,700 acres being involved, 52,000 acres would be fallowed per year under this scenario. So that's actually 1 in every 15 acres of irrigated land in western Colorado. So of course, the impacts all are much larger on a corresponding basis. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So again, one thing we don't want to fail to keep mentioning is that there is a fair amount of uncertainty in a study like this. We haven't seen a program of this scale in Colorado, really haven't seen a program of quite this scale anywhere in terms of across a broad region like western Colorado. And we believe that the impacts could vary depending on some of the some of the implementation characteristics, including whether we're just looking at full fallowing of harvested acres or potentially looking at split season fallowing or deficit irrigation. There's I think good reason to believe that a split season program, which was a popular option in the pilot program with the Grand Valley Water Users Association, can reduce some of these economic impacts. And finally, I mentioned that an important part of this study was to think about ways to try to maximize benefits and minimize adverse impacts if a demand management program were to be developed. And so first of all, we looked at how much impact would a program like this have relative to sort of the year-to-year variation in hay production that already occurs due to differences in how many acres are irrigated and harvested, and in terms of differences in climate and hydrologic conditions. And so overall, a sustained reduction of forage production of somewhere in the 4 to 5% range would basically be within kind of the range of historical experience over the last couple of decades. That would be a program that would be a little smaller than the more aggressive demand management scenario, but larger than the moderate one that we looked at. We think that there are several ways that designing the program could help minimize the potential risk of severe impacts on local communities. And one of the key aspects of that, we believe, is that the participation in the program needs to be widely spread, both across the 4 basins in Western Colorado and within each of those basins. And there's precedent for trying to do that with somewhat similar programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, which has a limit on the proportion of agriculture that can participate in the program by county. Another aspect that we think is important is that the frequency and duration of participation should be limited. We don't want to see this program like this become essentially an irrigated land retirement program, because that would have could have much more severe long-term consequences for the local communities. If the program were based on multi-year contracts, we think it could also be important to give participants the opportunity to opt out under very dry conditions when, frankly, the irrigation supply is the most valuable and the forage production is the most critical. And then, as I mentioned before, we do think that opportunities for other mechanisms other than full fallowing, like split season fallowing or other types of deficit irrigation, might reduce both the adverse impacts and potentially also even reduce the amount of compensation that would be needed to be paid to the participants. So that's kind of a quick run through of a pretty lengthy study, but appreciate the opportunity to walk through that with you guys today.
Thank you, Doug. That is definitely a lot of information for us to unpack. I want to give you a little bit of time to just take a quick break and introduce to our crowd here, Sonia Chavez. Sonia Chavez is the general manager of the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District. She's a native Coloradoan raised in a small community in southwestern Colorado. Sonia's passion for water and agriculture are deeply rooted in her family's ranching heritage. Sonia brings a unique perspective to the study of potential economic impacts of demand management. She's looked at this from a larger watershed scale perspective, having previously served as the Colorado River District staff lead for the Water Bank Work Group Economic Impact Study. Now she helps oversee the Upper Gunnison separate economic study of direct and secondary economic impacts of demand management in a small and isolated Western Colorado community. She's also served on the CWCB Economics and Local Government Work Group, providing input to the state of Colorado on economic considerations for a potential demand management program. Welcome, Sonia. It is so good to hear.
Hi, Alicia.
You really have worn a lot of hats and been in a lot of research into demand management. And Doug kind of left us with some ideas of things that we need to explore a little bit more, but I kind of wanted to hear from your perspective, what are some areas that you think need more analysis for a demand management program, and why?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. I've been watching the questions coming in, and I think we might be able to answer a few here. One of the big things that I think we need to look at is really the long-term impact of conserved consumptive use or fallowing on our soil health. Now, I was just on a call the other day, or a webinar that was taking place down in the Southwest area, and they were talking about how the impact of having bare soils and drought conditions at the same time, and how important it was to practice soil health and do cover cropping. So I think, you know, one of my opinions is that I agree with the economic study in the fact that I don't think that doing full fallowing is a good idea for our agricultural community. I think we really need to look more deeply about doing split season irrigation or partial fallowing of some sort in order to preserve our soil health, because one of the comments that the presenters had on that was that if you combine drought conditions and have bare soils and no cover crop to protect the soil temperatures, protect the biology, to protect the nutrients, just the general soil health, he's like, it's creating a drought on steroids, is what he said. So I really think that that's important.
For people who don't know what fallowing is, do you mind giving just a brief explanation of that so there's an understanding?
Sure. So under demand management, we could either choose to not put water, to not divert any water or apply it to the fields. So that's considered full fallowing. A split season irrigation type scenario is where maybe you put water on in the beginning of the season, and maybe you have a second watering, but you forego maybe your third or fourth watering. And there have been some studies done by Colorado State University on what the impacts of that might be and what might be the best scenario. So for instance, you might not want to forego that third season irrigation because that's the hottest and driest time of the year. So it might be better to actually be putting water on your crop at that time. So there have been studies on that. So.
Okay, so fallowing's something that we still need to explore a little bit more, but yeah, what are some other things that you're concerned about?
So one of the things that Doug mentioned was also geographic distribution. So there are, so I agree that we cannot have the impacts to communities economically if you had many participants within a basin participating in a program. So say the group decided that demand management should be done in 2021 in the Upper Gunnison Basin, and that's where we're going to focus this year. And next year it'll rotate to the Yampa Basin or something like that. The economic impacts are going to be greater, I believe, if we do a program in that way. And we also have to balance, I agree that you can minimize those impacts if you spread demand management out geographically, but one thing we also have to consider is that you might also be adding to the cost of actually overseeing that program because you have to monitor and verify all the results. And how does it, and can we really get wet water to any specific point in the river and shepherd it down if it's widely or geographically distributed? So in theory, it's a good idea. In actual implementation, there's going to have to be a balance between the monitoring and the verification and how you actually, it's going to increase the program costs essentially, the wider we distribute it. So pros and cons.
Definitely. And are there other studies being done right now on demand management that you can point to, or work that you know that's happening outside of this particular study?
Yeah, so I can let Aaron Duringson respond a little bit about I know he's well aware of what's going on in Wyoming. I will tell you that in the Upper Gunnison Basin, we are doing some grass fallow recovery research, where we are looking within the different sub-basins or sub-watersheds in the Upper Gunnison Basin. You know, if you take a field and you fallow it, how long does it take that field to recover? Anecdotally, we did hear information from our ranchers that it takes in the Upper Gunnison, because we have such shallow soils, sometimes 6 inches on top of the alluvium or gravel, that it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years for that crop or that field to recover. So that's something that we're looking at. And the second thing is just that the Upper Gunnison, and you mentioned this in when you announced me, is that the Upper Gunnison is doing a study of direct effects to our agricultural producers from a demand management program. And our study differs from the Water Bank Work Group study in the fact that we went out to about 9 producers distributed throughout the Upper Gunnison Basin and had one-on-one interviews with them to really get some insight into their agricultural operations and how they might make their decisions should they choose to participate in a demand management program, and to help add some clarity and some more clarity to, you know, kind of what are their concerns? What are they looking at when they think about it?
All important things to take a look at. Let's bring back Erin with the Nature Conservancy so we can hear about what the Nature Conservancy is working on next. Erin, tell us a little bit about this study you've got going on.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia, and thanks, Sonia. I think we've got a couple projects going on. I'd mention, you know, one, we're a partner in the Upper Colorado Water Conservation Project that's led by the Colorado Basin Roundtable and Paul Boucher, looking at you know, similar to what you mentioned, looking at the impacts of reduced irrigation on those high elevation perennial grass pastures. Those grass pastures make up, you know, some 85% of the irrigated ground in Western Colorado. And so we understand, you know, if and how we can reduce irrigation and generate water savings on those kinds of fields, right, which are very different from, you know, the row crops you might see in Uncompahgre or the Grand Valley, but do make up such a sizable portion of the acreage. And we've got a multi-year project there with Colorado State University and Utah State to look at the potential water savings from different water conservation activities, and then how those fields recover, the impacts to forage yield and forage quality, but then also critically from our perspective, looking at a few other things like potential impacts to bird habitat. We know that a lot of these ranches, you know, create great habitat for birds and other wildlife species. We want to make sure we're not unduly impacting that, or we want to understand what the potential impacts might be.
Yeah, and Erin, on that too, we, like in the Upper Gunnison, we have the Gunnison Basin sage grouse to consider. So, you know, when you have maybe conservation easements where there are sage grouse present and you're fallowing land adjacent to it, how does this affect the bird? So glad you guys are looking at that.
Looking at that, and then last one would be looking at stream flow impacts, and do we actually see, you know, the water savings that we assume we create on the field from not irrigating, and do we actually see those show up in the stream as something we could deliver downstream to another use, right? Whether it be demand management, in-stream flows, you know, another ranch that might need water, you know, et cetera. Because, you know, for me, the writing's on the wall. We've seen flows in the Colorado Basin decline almost 3 million acre feet since 2000. So whether it's demand management, whether it's soil health, whether it's some combination of all of the above, I think we're going to need these flexible water management tools to adapt to that future.
Well, it looks like, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just mention lastly that we are involved in another economic study in Wyoming that's maybe a hybrid between what Sonia and the Upper Gunnison are doing and the Water Bank work group's doing, where we surveyed a number of producers in the Upper Green Basin about how they might engage in a demand management program and what choices they might make, right? Whether to buy hay or reduce their herd or spend the money locally. And then we're using those results to do a similar analysis to what we've talked about today, and look forward to sharing those results probably in a couple months.
Sounds good. It looks like we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I want to go ahead and bring Doug back. There was a question specifically about what percentage of change in the local economy do these numbers reflect? Is that something you can answer for us, Doug?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have the specific number off the top of my head. It is, we do look at context, putting these impacts in context in the report. You know, when you look at the overall economy of Western Colorado, these numbers are pretty small in relation to the economy as a whole. I think there are somewhere on the order, I'm going to say around 400,000 jobs in total across Western Colorado. I think I may have that wrong, but that's the number that pops to mind. So when we look at even the scale of the impacts under the aggressive scenario, it's pretty small relative to the total economy, but it's larger as a share, of course, of the agricultural support economy.
Thank you for that. The next question, and I'm just kind of randomly going through and picking these questions. Did the group at all consider the additional water needed in subsequent years to reestablish the crops, like Sonia was speaking about earlier?
It didn't in the economic study, right, Doug?
Well, only insofar as you know, Sonia, we based a lot of this on agronomic studies that the Water Bank Work Group has been involved in. And that includes some side-by-side plot studies for grass hay where irrigation was withdrawn, and folks looked at then once you reestablish the water supply, how the crop yields come back. And you know, one of the things we didn't talk about in discussing the study today, but is a kind of a complex element in the study, is that, but you mentioned, Sonia, is that there is good reason to believe that for grass hay, which is the majority of the acreage, there will be a multiple year impact from fallowing, especially from full fallowing, maybe not as much from a partial fallowing program. But we did model that in our results. So we look at the impact both in the fallow year and also in a recovery year. Now those side-by-side plot studies haven't looked at, as far as I know at least, at the impacts of fallowing the same plot of ground for multiple years. So if you, instead of fallowing an acre of grass hay for 1 year and then restoring irrigation the next year, where you'd have a couple of years potentially impacts, if you fallow that same ground for several years, I don't know that there's a good answer yet in terms of how long it might take for the field to recover.
Yeah, and I think, Aaron, we had some questions about that too at one point about, anecdotally, we heard that, you know, following a year of potential fallowing or split season irrigation, you know, when that soil profile is really dry, do you actually use more water going into that next year because you're trying to refill that soil profile with water? So, and how does that balance out from year to year? So if you're conserving or saving water 1 year, but then you're using more the next year, does that really help us in the big picture, in a big picture perspective, net perspective?
Yeah, I think it's an important question that's far from settled. We did a follow-up survey with the participants in the Grand Valley Conserved Consumptive Use Project to ask them that question, and the results were mixed, right? Some said there was no change, or it was just as fine to irrigate the following year after they fallowed. Some said they had a harder time, and so it's pretty inconclusive. And then for the Colorado Headwaters project I mentioned, we're going to hopefully provide some data for that question with the stream flow analysis. And so we'll see, is there a trade-off, right? Do we see a big bump in flows this year? And is that offset, and to what degree might it be offset by lower flows in the following year because you've got to refill that soil moisture profile? So I think it's an outstanding question.
Right, and I think if you did cover cropping, that might help to retain nutrients and water within that soil for a longer period of time, and that could help to mitigate any of these potential impacts. So.
Yeah, if you're fallowing, yeah, if you've got grass, you know, you're not going to put a cover crop in there. But
right.
But we do want to understand, and it's another aspect of the project we're discussing, is are there factors that might help improve recovery? And so if you don't irrigate for 1 year, but you're planning to the next, or you know, down the road, maybe a year and a half or so, would it help to do a green manure application or manure application? Would it help to interseed, you know, another grass crop? Could you help these grasses recover more quickly or more robustly through certain practices? So if you're planning on doing a water conservation activity on your place, you know, again, how might you help improve that going forward?
You know, Doug posed a question earlier. All of this is sounding pretty, like it could be a pretty expensive program. And one of the questions we have is, where does the money come from to finance such a program like this?
Well, Alicia, that is a great question, of course. And, you know, one thing I think I should mention is that obviously our study and the work we've done with the Water Bank Work Group is just one of many pieces of the puzzle. I'm sure everybody's getting that impression because there's a lot of other things going on. And I know that the Colorado Water Conservation Board recently had a bunch of work groups, a number of work groups that they established to look at all the different dimensions, or many of the different dimensions of a potential demand management program. And I know that one of those committees was looking at the finance aspects. And I don't know if Sonia may have a little bit more information about where that committee wound up or what some of their ideas were.
So I can tell you, we did have a joint meeting with the environmental group, and we did hear some more from the finance committee group. I think it depends on whether, you know, a statewide program might be more efficient, but we also talked about the fact that in making the decision on whether a proposed project would have impacts on adjacent landowners or downstream landowners, they talked about where you would go to get that kind of local information to be able to make a decision that when someone comes in and says, I have a good project and there are going to be no damages or impact to downstream water users, local communities and people with input and who know the area could provide that input. you know, we had that discussion, and then and just what that would take and how much time and how long it would take someone to get through the process. But then we also put out the question there, does it make sense to actually give that money to folks like in Uncompahgre Valley water users or in Upper Gunnison, and allow them to carry out that demand management in a program that they believe will best minimize local economic impacts. So I think that was one of the items out there that they agreed probably needed to, it was going to take more explanation and study.
Yeah, it seems like we've really got to understand, you know, how big do we want a program to be? What's the balance between a program that might provide effective, you know, protection against compact curtailment with one that's going to be too costly or too impactful? So what's the size, and then what's the structure? Because that dictates, like you were saying, Sonia, do you have to pay a lot of transaction costs to make sure it's distributed or to make sure you're addressing unintended consequences? Is the funding coming from the state, the federal government, private entities? There's a lot of potential sources, each with their own, you know, considerations that stakeholders are going to have to work through.
And I think one of the big things that came out of this study was that the programs are going to have to be so unique depending on where the Western Slope is just very diverse, and so I don't think there's not going to be a one size fits all. And so I think these programs are really going to have to be structured to fit local concerns and differences in watersheds and soils, and whether you're working with row crops or high elevation grass pasture. It's just, yeah, it's going to have to be a dynamic program, a diverse program.
Yeah, and different opportunities too. I know one thing I've been surprised by working with ag producers on this is just how many different approaches they've come to me with to try and create water savings. And so balancing the, you know, the flexibility that they would want to make it work for them with, you know, a program that's cost effective and efficient is going to be
Yeah,
good,
and in the Upper
discussion.
Gunnison study, one of the big things that came out is that just, you know, every ranching operation is different. The way they make their decisions is different. So, you know, it's just gonna, and ag operators don't make decisions on the fly. You plan years in advance on what you're going to do, whether it's the size of your cattle herd, your grazing allotments that you might have with the Forest Service. They don't want to put those at risk. You know, they just, there's a lot to this, and there's a lot for them to think about. And I think that's one of the Upper Gunnison's concern, is that we really want to ensure that going into this, that ag producers know what to expect. And I think we really would want to see a program that does not negatively impact agriculture, and that's well balanced within the state of Colorado.
And I think there's been a lot of discussion and studies on what this will do with ag. But Aaron, from the TNC perspective, how does this affect our environment? Have you explored that?
Yeah, we have just really started to explore it and look at it both through the work we're doing in Upper Colorado project, where we're looking at potential impacts to bird habitat versus potential stream flow improvements. We want to make sure that we understand potential consequences there. And then, you know, we know that a lot of rivers and streams throughout the West are short of the flows they need to be healthy. And this could potentially be a way to put more water back in streams, but a lot of that is very site specific. And we want to make sure that, you know, if we're doing work to put more water back in streams, you know, with partners and willing participants, we're doing it in the right way. And we're not creating trade-offs with, you know, getting more water in at one time and sacrificing it at another time, or sacrificing wildlife habitat that we've spent, you know, really decades trying to protect. Sonia mentioned conservation easements. Just in Western Colorado, TNC has about 100,000 acres of conservation easements on working ranches, right, that are designed to protect those working lands and their associated wildlife habitat. And so we want to make sure we're not jeopardizing that habitat by we're either trying to tackle these broader water security issues or trying to do local, you know, work on stream flows. You know, that said, again, kind of back to the bigger picture, the writing's on the wall. The flows are declining dramatically, almost 3 million acre feet since 2000. And we've got to figure out a way to deal with the implications of that for water users and deal with the implications for that for the environment. None of that is going to be free. None of that is going to be easy. And so To me, it all comes down to how do you find the right tool for the job, whether it's crafting demand management to be an effective tool, but also making sure we have other things like supporting soil health, supporting watershed health. We've talked a lot about demand management as like an insurance policy, right? But you don't just buy an insurance policy for your car and then, drive it around recklessly, right? Like you also wear your seatbelt, and you also make sure you get your oil changed. And so what are those other components along with demand management that can help provide water security, protect our rivers, make sure they're healthy, the whole picture.
Hey, Aaron, interesting statistic. I was just talking to the Gunnison Ranch Land Conservation Legacy, and she was giving me the number that in the Upper Gunnison Basin alone, we have almost 100,000 acres in conservation easement up here alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we started to ask ourselves with that was even, if you look at those conservation easements and when they went into place, many of those easements after 2000 probably have fallowing language within them, or water leasing language. Many of the ones prior to that probably do not. And so if we broke that out up here in the Upper Gunnison, what would that look like? So how many additional acres of land would actually be available for potential participation in a demand management program? And yeah, and I think Alicia too, just on Aaron and onto the recreational kind of thing, I was thinking this year was a good year for the Upper Gunnison to really look at what the impacts of drought were on our community. So this was a tough year. And on the Gunnison main stem, a good amount of our economy is tied into commercial angling and whitewater rafting and people using the reservoir, highly, highly dependent on our water. This year, if we hadn't had Taylor Reservoir, or if we had let all the water go by us, or we were implementing a demand management program at a high level, that water would have come and gone in a pulse. We're a high mountain water community dependent upon our snowpack, and we don't have a ton of storage higher upstream. So, Taylor Reservoir, we were able to, put some additional water into the stream and extend our angling and rafting season they were begging for a week, and so what happens if you don't have that storage? What does that look like for our community?
That's continuing to be explored. We are quickly running out of time, but I want to make sure that I get this last question in because I think it's an important one, and it's for you, Doug. What's the impact of demand management versus something else or nothing at all?
Well, that's a great question, Alicia. And it's sort of the one question everybody would like to have a more firm answer to. And the reason I say that is, Aaron mentioned that demand management is like an insurance policy, and I think that's true, or a potential insurance policy. But the question is, how likely is that car crash to occur if we don't do demand management? And that's the one that's harder to get to. Another project that the River District and the Water Bank Work Group have been involved with over the last several years is the risk study, which is really focusing on the hydrologic risk and analyzing that. And I think the one thing we can feel fairly confident about is that a proactive demand management program that reduces consumptive use through voluntary and compensated means is likely to be less burdensome or less onerous than a sudden curtailment, in which case no one's being compensated, everyone's having to reduce their use. And so, looked at from that perspective, demand management could certainly be better than a curtailment. But the question is, the really tough question to answer is how much would a demand management program of this scale or any scale impact the probability of a curtailment and the severity of a curtailment? And I think we're still working to get better answers to that.
Well, if nobody else wants to comment on that, I will wrap things up here. It's been a great conversation talking with you guys about demand management and this study. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today. As a reminder to everyone out there, if we weren't able to get to your questions, we are adding emails for Doug, Sonia, and Aaron in our chat section so that you can email them your questions. our Water with Your Lunch series is going to be starting back in October. So if you want to go ahead and mark your calendars for our first event there, it will be October 14th. Be on the lookout for more information on that through our social media, website, news drop, and our newsletter that'll be coming out soon. I really want to sign off today just by saying thank you to everyone. Thank you for allowing us here at the River District to serve you for more than 80 years. We can't do what we do without the support of our partners, our constituents, and it's because of you that we're able to bring common interests together and find solutions. It's because of you that we're able to keep fighting. So thank you very much. And remember, these are your rivers, this is your water, and we're your Colorado River District. Have a great afternoon.